I'm thrilled to be so closely and deeply connected to this spiritual community, and it's an honor and privilege to be here so often doing so many things with you guys. So my talk today is called, Is Racism a Spiritual Problem? And that has a lot to do with my piece in Science of Mind magazine called Dismantling Racism. Yeah. So if you want to leave right now, that's okay, if that's not why you're here, but just wanted to warn you. But I wanted to begin with an acknowledgement, and I want to ask you to join me in acknowledging that we gather here this morning on the ancestral lands of the Kumeyaay Nation, and that they lived here in this beautiful river valley for 10,000 years, raising their families, innumerable generations before the coming of the tall ships and the soldiers and the missionaries and the rancheros and the cattle that they grazed up these valleys that destroyed their fisheries, destroyed the natural botanical environment, their food source. And it was the end of one civilization and the beginning of ours. And my home is just a couple miles over this hill. I live on stolen land too, land that was never paid for, acknowledged, atoned for, or explained in any way. And so I know that here in this spiritual community, we love the truth. And so it's powerful, isn't it, to just say out loud and acknowledge the truth, not in guilt or shame. You know, I wasn't there. But in the simple acknowledgement of what is. There's that great line in the Gospel of John, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. Okay, I added that last part. So I've been on a bit of a journey these last two or three years, and that's really the genesis of this talk today, and I wanted to share a little bit of that journey with you. You know, what is spiritual practice for? What is our spirituality for? Is it medicine for our private woundedness? Is it a lifeline for our painful alienation? Yes. But it is also a call to action. It's not just a private experience of comfort. It's a call to the street. And this is where it starts to get uncomfortable. Because you see, for many of us, and I certainly count myself among this group, I came to spirituality for personal healing. I was in a bit of trouble. And I came into communities like this and into teachings like this because I wanted to feel better. I wanted to become whole instead of fragmented. I wanted to be a part of something instead of disconnected. I didn't come here maybe for all of the answers, but at least for some of them. And at least for the comfort that we get here in the face of life's most vexing questions, like, what am I? What is God? What is death? Are chicken McNuggets really made out of chicken? Okay, that's not something we're going to learn here. And so a lot of us have been on our spiritual paths for many, many years, right? For decades even. But what is spirituality for? Is it about comfort? Is it about feeling better? Or is it about leading us to real wisdom, to real growth, to real change within and without? So I want to share with you today about a shift that I've been feeling that's been moving through me like a river, changing the shape of me, the way a river changes the riverbed. And the way I want to focus that process today is around this question with you this morning. Is racism a spiritual problem? Because a lot of us think of it as a political problem. Oh, he's talking politics. Or a sociological problem. But I want to pose it this way. Is it a spiritual problem? And I think it is for two reasons. First of all, and we all know this part, the scriptures of the world's wisdom traditions call us constantly, don't they, to overcome our fear and love one another, to treat each other as beings of infinite value. You heard it in all of the statements that have been made this morning by Paul, by Jean, by Rachel. It's in all of our messaging to love one another, to treat one another as beings of infinite value. Last time I was here, I talked about Jesus and the Good Samaritan story. We all know it. And in the Good Samaritan story, Jesus shows us that we have a moral obligation to care for one another regardless of tribe or ethnicity or race. Or when Jesus says, however you treat the least of these, you treat me. He is reminding us of the God identity in each of us. This is not news to anybody here. And jump outside the tradition of Christianity. Look at what Buddha taught 25 centuries ago. He challenged the moral rectitude of the caste system already 25 centuries ago. That if we are all aspects of one divine essence, then how can we justify treating entire categories of people as lesser or better than other categories? That's a contradiction that makes no sense. And so that seems sort of plainly spoken in all of these wisdom traditions we say we revere. But you know what? We've been reading and studying and adoring and worshiping these words and teachings for thousands of years, but it hasn't stuck. Nothing's changed. Hate crimes are on the rise sharply. Anti-Semitism is on the rise sharply all over the world. Nazis and racists are emboldened by our silence and apparent complicity. Now, here's the second reason that I think racism is a spiritual problem, and this is a little more complicated. Let's turn our eyes to New Thought, to these New Thought teachings. Through the teachings of Ernest Holmes in Science of Mind, and through the Fillmores of the Unity Movement, and all the teachers that came before them. In our immersion in this New Thought groundswell, we have been challenged to reconsider the role that our own thoughts play in the construction of our reality. Throughout New Thought, we have all come to learn that our reality, our worldview, is largely an outpicturing of our inner world, right? Our thoughts and concepts are the lens through which we view reality. As the Jewish Book of Wisdom, the Talmud puts it, we do not see things as they are, we see things as we are. Today we call that unconscious bias. And in the collected sayings of the Buddha, again, in the Dhammapada, the opening line is, our life is a product of our thoughts. Our thoughts of yesterday built our life of today, and our thoughts of today build our life of tomorrow. Our life is a product of our thoughts, says Buddha in verse 1 of the Dhammapada. That's a new thought, isn't it? Not so new. And so these perennial insights reveal for us an unimpeachable truth, that consciousness has enormous power, the power to destroy and the power to create, the power to harm and the power to heal, the power to build our world. And we must choose. It's that simple. There's a choice to be made in this process. Now, in modern psychology and in cognitive studies, scientists think a lot about slow thinking versus fast thinking. Have you heard that term before? Let me share this with you. It's fascinating. Slow thinking and fast thinking. So let's say you're hiking out here in the beautiful Mission Trails Regional Park, and it's twilight. And up ahead on the trail, you see a snake. And you get a little closer and you realize, oh, it's just a rope. So what happened there? You saw a shape with your visual perception. You saw a shape on the trail. And immediately the Google image search starts. Like, what is that thing? What is it? Is that a baseball bat? Is it a garden hose? That's unlikely. I'm up here in the hills. Oh, it's a rattlesnake, and I don't want to die of a rattlesnake bite. So our fear identifies the item. That's called fast thinking. And you know what? Fast thinking is good because it keeps you alive. I think Darwinian evolution, natural selection, favors fast thinking. Is that an edible mushroom? Is that a mushroom that is going to kill me? Or is that one I should harvest for the priest? And make sure the kids only get one of those. And so you kind of need to know quickly, how am I going to stay alive? You know, I want to have offspring. So the biological imperative favors fast thinking. But as you can see, fast thinking is fear-based and often wrong. Now here comes slow thinking. Animals do this, right? Our minds are simply built this way. When you see a face that doesn't look like you and your family, you pull back and you risk assess. Is this a threat or a friend? This comes out of our biological programming. That's fast thinking. If you just stay there, that's a disaster. Slow thinking is the cure. Slow thinking takes time. It's far more self-aware. Slow thinking catches fast thinking in the act and says, hold on. That's not a snake, that's a rope. You're wrong. And if you act from that error, you are compounding the problem and inflicting suffering. So it turns out that old Oscar and Hammerstein song from South Pacific, "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught," is wrong. It's half wrong. Do you remember that song? You've got to be carefully taught to hate and fear. You've got to be carefully taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. Right? It's a great lyric, right? As a songwriter, I'm like, damn, that is good. And I get it, and it's not wrong. Racism and other hate consciousness is, of course, conditioned, codified, and taught by dominant cultures. But that might not be its prime origin. That's not its only source, let's put it that way. There are compelling innate tendencies to be overcome as well. I'm talking about the power of consciousness and how we have then the power to reform our own consciousness. So in other words, the dominant group builds on this unfortunate cognitive error to its own advantage. It was to the economic advantage of slave-owning whites to define Africans as inferior. In 1619, when the first ship landed in Virginia with black African slaves, those wealthy landowners benefited economically from slave ownership. The diminishment of the value of brown and black lives became institutionalized. An entire economic system calcified around this horror. And so the deeply entrenched and structural and systematic racism of the United States was born in 1619 when that first ship landed. And at the end of the Civil War in 1865, 246 years later, a majority of states ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which ended slavery. But as many of you know, the 13th Amendment had built into it a loophole big enough to drive a Mack truck through. And it said basically that no one could ever be again held against their will unless they had committed a crime. That's the only way they could get the slave-holding states to ratify. You know how ratifying the Constitution is. It takes just about everybody. So overnight, the criminalization of color was born. Throughout the South, as the Southern economy struggled to reinvent itself after the catastrophic economic disaster from its point of view of the end of slavery, overnight, police forces were born. Black men were routinely arrested for vague or invented charges like vagrancy or loitering. They were demonized in racist propaganda. They were put back in chains on work gangs and sold to industry for labor. This was slavery 2.0. And I never learned any of this in school. Not one word of it. The only black person I ever heard about in school was Booker T. Washington. Look, this isn't the place for us to tell in great detail this entire sad and tragic narrative. For that, go see Ava DuVernay's amazing documentary, 13th. It's on your Netflix. The film 13th tells the story of the 13th Amendment. Because then after that came the lynchings and the sundown towns and the black codes. Google black codes. Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the for-profit prison industry, It goes right up to today. There's a through line back to that first slave ship in 1619. In other words, the bad consciousness of racism and othering, it got woven into the very structures of our society, resulting in multi-generational injustice. After World War II, this is something I learned from Debbie Irving's book, Waking Up White. After World War II, for a variety of reasons, black veterans were largely excluded from the benefits of the GI Bill that white veterans received, which, as you know, the GI Bill gave low-cost home loans. And as you also know, home ownership is the primary engine of multi-generational wealth in this country. My mom and dad, who died a few years ago, my two brothers and I inherited their home. And we sold it this last year and got a nice little check, all three of us did. Multi-generational wealth comes primarily for most Americans from home ownership. So after World War II, when white families began to establish that multi-generational wealth, black families were excluded. Add to that redlining, again, Google that. The wealth gap between black and white Americans began to widen, and today, as many of you realize, the wealth gap between black families and white families, well, average white family wealth is 10 times more than average black family wealth. And we have got to stop defining poverty as a personal failure. And acknowledge its deep structural causes. I could go on for hours about this and other data points, but again, we're here to think through principles, not perhaps all these details. So what's the hard truth? The hard truth is that we have inherited a system intentionally designed by white supremacists to favor white people and disadvantage people of color. Now, I did not personally design this system, but I sure as hell benefit from it. And that privilege brings with it a moral obligation, I believe. This is, as white people, our work to do. And herein lies our hope. And there is hope. I don't want to leave you here this morning in despair. Let's enter into this work with our hearts full, with our eyes raised, not crushed under the horror of what has passed so long for normal. We're not here to wallow in the past. We're not here to relive trauma or to beat white people down with guilt and shame. Let's feel all those feelings for a moment, and then let's use them as fuel to fuel our commitment to no longer remain on the sidelines of this work. We can undo this. It's a big job. It's structural. But you know what? Somebody built it so it can be unbuilt. It's that simple. there's a certain defeatism I feel all the time, like, well, it's just inevitable. The things are just the way that, no. This was intentionally designed and constructed this way to benefit certain categories of people and to oppress others, to dehumanize others. That's plain. And so the question is, whose job is it to restructure all of that? And how to do it? And that's where we need all hands on deck. It's not one person's job. So, racism is not somebody else's problem. It's my problem. And I was largely blind to my own unconscious bias. I thought I was this nice liberal guy. I loved everybody. I'm not the problem, right? I don't judge. And then I started realizing that racism is not the overt hatred of the other. It's unconscious, like seeing a rope on a trail and thinking it's a snake. It's that insidious. It's that sneaky. And to undo it, we have to be sneakier. So I was largely blind to this work until I dove into it about 3 years ago. You know, I read, and I recommend you read Debbie Irving's life-changing book, Waking Up White. I don't connect with her on a lot of levels. She comes from a very high economic class, East Coast, country club life. But her book is really potent on the issue of white privilege, or if you prefer the phrase, unearned privilege. Look, racism is an inside job, and in that sense, it is spiritual work. That's the bottom line here. Racism is an inside job. Our personal and communal healing begins with the admission that we all have unconscious bias. If you're one of those white people who says, I'm not racist, I don't see color, I need to talk to you after this. And you know what? It's okay. It's okay to not know what you don't know. How can you know what you don't know? You can only do as good as you understand. So this is a re-education process. And if you're sitting there feeling resistance to these ideas and thinking, man, I'm sorry I came here today. I didn't want to get challenged this way. You know, as a white person, I can check in and out of the uncomfortableness of the racism question. My black friends cannot check out. From miles away, you can see who they are and what they look like. I can pass anywhere I like, and that's my privilege. When I walk onto a car lot to buy a car, I'm treated differently. When I go to a job interview, I'm treated differently. I have a white-sounding name. My college application was treated differently, etc., etc., etc. It's not my fault. But I have the power and the privilege to choose to step into the discomfort of this conversation. And I think it's a spiritual and moral obligation to, in fact, do so. So I would just ask you to commit to some education. Watch 13th. Put it in your Netflix queue. Get ready to cry. Get ready to feel lousy for 90 minutes. But it is mind-blowingly important. Read Debbie Irving's Waking Up White. It's a fantastic book. Or take in some of the other excellent work being created around these issues. There's so much powerful work being done around these things. The 1619 Project at New York Times. The New Jim Crow. Book after book, film after film. So I think, bottom line here, here's where I'll wrap it up. In spiritual communities like this, we bear a special responsibility to be the tip of the spear in this holy, sacred work, because we're the ones that understand how powerful consciousness is. We are already hungering for the reconnection of our fractured human family. And we know what the process of conscious transformation is like. We practice awakening here every day. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. This is our work to do. So let us take bold steps together toward awakening this country and the whole world from the nightmare of racism and discrimination. One new thought at a time. We're better than this, and it's time to do better. Amen. Namaste.